Chapter 8. Fixed Capital and Circulating Capital. Section 1. The Formal Distinctions. We saw in Volume 1, Chapter 8, that one part of the constant capital maintains the specific use form in which it enters the production process, over and against the products that it helps to fashion. It continues to perform the same function over a shorter or longer period, in a series of repeated labor processes. Examples of this are factory buildings, machines, etc. In short, everything that we collect together under the description of means of labor. This part of the constant capital gives up value to the product in proportion to the exchange value that it loses together with its use value. The extent to which the value of such a means of production is given up or transferred to the product that it helps to fashion is determined by an average calculation. It is measured by the average duration of its function, from the time that it enters the production process as means of production to the time that it is completely used up, is dead, and has to be replaced or reproduced by a new item of the same kind. The peculiarity of this part of the constant capital, the means of labor, in the strict sense, is this. A part of the capital has been advanced in a form of constant capital, i.e. means of production, which then functions as factors of the labor process so long as they maintain the independent use shape with which they entered it. The finished product, and thus also the elements of its formation, insofar as they are transformed into the product, is ejected from the production process and passes as a commodity from the sphere of production into that of circulation. The means of labor, on the other hand, never leave the production sphere once they have stepped into it. Their function confines them firmly within it. A part of the capital value advanced is fixed in this form, which is determined by the function of the means of labor in the process. As a means of labor functions and is used up, one part of its value passes over to the product, while another part remains fixed in the means of labor and hence in the production process. The value fixed in this way steadily declines until the means of labor is worn out and has therefore distributed its value, in a longer or shorter period, over the volume of products that have emerged from a series of continually repeated labor processes. As long as a means of labor still remains effective and does not yet have to be replaced by a new item of the same kind, some constant capital value remains fixed in it, while another part of the value originally fixed in it passes over to the product and thus circulates as a component of the commodity stock. The longer the means of labor lasts, and the more slowly it wears out, the longer the constant capital value remains fixed in this use form. But whatever its degree of durability, the proportion in which it gives up value is always in inverse ratio to the overall duration of its function. If two machines are of equal value, but one of them wears out in 5 years and the other in 10, then the first gives up twice as much value in the same space of time as the second does. The part of the capital value that is fixed in the means of labor circulates, just like any other part. As we have seen, the whole of the capital value is in constant circulation, and in this sense, therefore, all capital is circulating capital. But the circulation of the part of the capital considered here is a peculiar one. In the first place, it does not circulate in its use form. It is rather its value that circulates, and this does so gradually, bit by bit, in the degree to which it is transferred to the product that circulates as a commodity. A part of its value always remains fixed in it as long as it continues to function and remains distinct from the commodities that it helps to produce. This peculiarity is what gives this part of the constant capital the form of fixed capital. All other material components of the capital advanced in the production process, on the other hand, form, by contrast to it, circulating or fluid capital. There's a further part of the means of production, those ancillaries that are consumed by the means of labor proper as they function, such as coal by the steam engine, or which only support the action, such as gas for lighting, etc., which also do not enter the product in their material form. It is only their value that constitutes part of the value of the product. The product circulates their value in its own circulation, and they have this in common with fixed capital. But they are completely consumed in every labor process that they enter into, and therefore, with each new labor process, they must be completely replaced by new items of the same kind. They do not preserve their independent use shape as they function, and so no part of the capital value either remains fixed in their old use shape, their natural form. The fact that this part of the ancillaries does not materially enter into the product, but enters the value of the product only according to its own value, and the related fact that the function of these materials is confined within the sphere of production, has misled economists such as Ramsay, who at the same time confuses fixed and constant capital, into applying them the category of fixed capital. The part of the means of production that enters the product materially, i.e. raw materials, etc., thereby receives, to some extent, a form in which it can later enter individual consumption as a means of enjoyment. Means of labor, for their part, the material bearers of fixed capital, are consumed only productively and cannot enter individual consumption, since they do not enter the product or use value which they help to fashion, but rather maintain their independent shape vis-a-vis it until they are completely worn out. An exception to this is provided by the means of transport. The use effect that these produce in their productive function, i.e. during their stay in the sphere of production, the change of location, simultaneously enters individual consumption. For example, that of the traveler. The latter then pays for their use just as he pays for the use of other means of consumption. As we have seen, the distinction between raw material and ancillaries can become blurred, as in the manufacture of chemicals, for example. The same is true with the distinction between means of labor on the one hand and ancillaries and raw materials on the other. In agriculture, for instance, the materials added to improve the soil partly enter the plant product as formative elements. Their effect, however, is spread over a fairly long period, for example 4 to 5 years. One part of these, therefore, enters the product materially and thus immediately transfers its value to it, while another part remains fixed in its old use form, so that its value does too. It continues to exist as means of production and hence receives the form of fixed capital. An ox, as a draft animal, is fixed capital. If it is eaten, however, it no longer functions either as means of labor or as fixed capital. The quality that gives a part of the capital value spent on means of production, the character of fixed capital, lies exclusively in the specific manner in which this value circulates. This particular manner of circulation arises from the particular way in which the means of labor gives up value to the product, or acts to form value during the production process. This in turn arises from the special way in which the means of labor function in the labor process. We know that the same use value that emerges from one labor process in the shape of a product can enter another labor process as means of production. It is only the function of a product as a means of labor in the production process that makes it fixed capital. It is in no way fixed capital in itself, just as it emerges from a process. A machine that is the product and thus the commodity of a machine builder is part of his commodity capital. It only becomes fixed capital in the hands of its buyer, the capitalist who employs it productively. Assuming that all other circumstances remain the same, the degree of fixedness grows with the durability of the means of labor. On this durability depends the size of the difference between the capital value fixed in means of labor and the part of this value that is given up to the product in repeated labor processes. The more slowly this value is given up, and the means of labor gives up value with each repetition of the same labor process, the greater is the capital still fixed, and the greater the difference between the capital employed in the production process and the capital consumed in it. Once this difference has disappeared, the means of labor has lived out its time and lost its value together with its use value. It has ceased to be a bearer of value. Since the means of labor, like every other material bearer of constant capital, gives up value to the product only to the extent that it loses its value together with its use value, then the longer it lasts out in the production process, the longer is the period for which constant capital remains fixed in it. If a means of production which is not a means of labor in the strict sense, for example, ancillaries, raw material, semi-finished goods, etc., behaves with respect to the way it gives up value, and hence to the mode of circulation of its value in the same way as a means of labor, then it is also a material bearer, a form of existence, of fixed capital. This is the case with the already mentioned improvements to the soil, which put into it chemical components whose effect extends over several periods of production or several years. Here, one part of the value continues to exist alongside the product in its independent shape, or in the shape of fixed capital, while another portion of value is given up to the product and hence circulates with it. In a case like this, it is not only a part of the value of the fixed capital that enters the product, but also the use value, the substance in which this portion of value exists. Besides their basic error, their confusion of the categories of fixed and circulating capital with the categories of constant and variable capital, the confusion and the demarcation of concepts made by previous economists, rest primarily on the following points. Firstly, certain properties that characterize the means of labor materially are made into direct properties of fixed capital, for example, physical immobility, such as that of a house. But it is always easy to show that other means of labor, which are also as such fixed capital, ships, for example, have the opposite property, i.e., physical mobility. Alternatively, the formal economic characteristic that arises from the circulation of value is confused with a concrete property. as if things, which are never capital at all in themselves, could already in themselves and by nature be capital in a definite form, fixed or circulating. We saw in Chapter 7 of Volume 1 that the means of production in any labor process, irrespective of the social conditions under which it is pursued, are divisible into means of labor and object of labor. It is only within the capitalist mode of production, however, that the two become capital, in fact, productive capital as defined in Part 1. Here, the distinction between means of labor and object of labor, which is based in the nature of the labor process itself, is reflected in the new form of the distinction between fixed capital and circulating capital. It is only in this way that a thing that functions as means of labor becomes fixed capital. If its material properties also allow it to serve for other functions than that of means of labor, then whether it is a fixed capital or not depends on these various functions. Cattle, as draft animals, are fixed capital. When being fattened for slaughter, they are raw material that eventually passes into circulation as a product, and so not fixed, but circulating capital. The mere length of time for which a means of production is fixed, in repeated labor processes which are related and continuous and hence form a production period, i.e. the total production time that is needed in order to complete the product, already involves a longer or shorter advance for the capitalist, just as is the case with fixed capital, but this alone does not make his capital fixed capital. Seed, for example, is not fixed capital, but simply raw material that is fixed in the production process for approximately a year. All capital that functions as productive capital is fixed in the production process, and thus so are all the elements of that productive capital, whatever may be their material shape, their function, or the mode of circulation of their value. Whether they are fixed in this way for a longer or shorter time, according to the kind of production process or the intended useful effect, is not what makes the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. Some of the means of labor, including the general conditions of labor, are held fast in their place once they enter the production process as means of labor and are made ready for their productive function. Machines, for example. Other means of labor, however, are produced from the start in this static form, tied to the spot, such as improvements to the soil, factory buildings, blast furnaces, canals, railways, etc. The continued attachment of the means of labor to the production process in which it is to function is here simultaneously conditioned by its sensuous mode of existence. On the other hand, a means of labor may constantly change its physical place, i.e. move, and yet be engaged throughout in the production process, as with a locomotive, a ship, draft cattle, etc. Immobility does not give it the character of fixed capital in the one case, nor does mobility remove this character in the other. But the circumstance that some means of labor are fixed in location, with their roots in the soil, gives this part of the fixed capital a particular role in a nation's economy. They cannot be sent abroad or circulate as commodities on the world market. It is quite possible for the property titles to this fixed capital to change. They can be bought and sold, and in this respect circulate ideally. These property titles can even circulate on foreign markets, in the form of shares, for example. But a change in the persons who are the owners of this kind of fixed capital does not change the relationship between the static and materially fixed part of the wealth of a country and the movable part of it. The peculiar circulation of fixed capital gives rise to a peculiar turnover. The portion of value that it loses in its natural form by wear and tear circulates as a value portion of the product. Through its circulation, the product is transformed from a commodity into money, and so is the portion of the value of the means of labor that is circulated by the product. Its value trickles from the circulation process as money in the same proportion that this means of labor ceases to be a bearer of value in the production process. Its value thus acquires a dual existence. A part of it remains tied to its use form or natural form, which pertains to the production process, while another part separates off from this as money. In the course of its function, the part of the value of the means of labor that exists in the natural form steadily declines, while the part of its value converted into the money form steadily increases, until the means of labor eventually expires and its entire value has been separated off from its dead body and has been transformed into money. Here we can see the peculiarity that this element of the productive capital displays in its turnover. The transformation of its value into money accompanies step by step the transformation into money of the commodity that bears its value. But its transformation back from the money form into the use form is separate from the transformation of the commodity back into its former elements of production, and is rather determined by its own reproduction period, i.e. by the time for which the means of labor serves until it has to be replaced by another item of the same kind. If a machine with a value of £10,000, say, lasts for 10 years, then the turnover time of the value originally advanced in it is 10 years. Until this time has elapsed, it does not need to be renewed, but continues to function in its natural form. In the meantime, its value circulates bit by bit as a portion of the value of the commodities that it steadily serves to produce, and is thus gradually converted into money until finally, at the end of 10 years, it has been completely transformed into money and from money back into a machine, i.e., has completed its turnover. Until this reproduction time arrives, its value is accumulated gradually, in the first instance in the form of a money reserve fund. The remaining elements of productive capital consist in part of the elements of the constant capital existing in the ancillaries and raw materials, and in part of variable capital, laid out in labor power. In analyzing the processes of labor and valorization, see Volume 1, Chapter 7, we showed how these different components behave quite differently in the formation of products and value. The value of the part of constant capital that consists of ancillaries and raw materials, just like the value of the part that consists of means of labor, reappears in the value of the product simply as transferred value, while labor power, through the labor process, adds to the product an equivalent of its value or actually reproduces its value. Furthermore, one part of the ancillary material, coal for heating, gas for lighting, etc., is consumed in the labor process without physically entering the product, while another part does enter the product bodily and forms the material of its substance. All these differences are irrelevant, however, as far as the circulation and hence the mode of turnover are concerned. Insofar as ancillary and raw materials are completely consumed in the formation of the product, they transfer their entire value to the product. This value is thus completely circulated via the product, transformed into money, and from money back into the elements of production of the commodity. Its turnover is not interrupted, like that of the fixed capital, but passes continuously through the entire circuit of its forms, so that these elements of the productive capital are constantly renewed in kind. Insofar as the variable capital is concerned, i.e., the component part of the productive capital that is spent on labor power, this labor power is bought for a definite period of time. Once the capitalist has bought it and incorporated it into the production process, it forms a component of his capital, and in fact precisely its variable component. It functions daily for a certain space of time in which it adds to the product not only its entire daily value, but also an additional surplus value, which we shall in the first instance ignore. When the labor power has been bought for 1 week, for example, and functioned for this time, the purchase must continually be repeated at the customary intervals. The equivalent of its value, which labor power adds to the product during its function, and which is transformed into money as the product circulates, must constantly be transformed back from money into labor power, or constantly describe the complete circuit of its forms, i.e. turnover, if the cycle of continuous production is not to be interrupted. The part of the value of the productive capital that is advanced for labor power thus completely passes over to the product, we are still ignoring the surplus value, describes together with it the two metamorphoses pertaining to the circulation sphere, and remains permanently incorporated in the production process by way of this constant renewal. No matter how differently labor power acts with respect to value formation from the components of constant capital that do not form fixed capital, this manner of turnover of its value is something that it has in common with the latter, in contrast to the fixed capital. Because of this common characteristic in their turnover, these components of productive capital, the portions of value spent on labor power and on means of production that do not form fixed capital, confront fixed capital as circulating or fluid capital. We saw previously how the money that the capitalist pays to the worker for the use of his labor power is in fact only the general equivalent form of the worker's necessary means of subsistence. In this respect, the variable capital consists materially of means of subsistence. Here, however, in considering the turnover, we are dealing with the form. What the capitalist buys is not the worker's means of subsistence, but his actual labor power. It is not the worker's means of subsistence that form the variable part of the capitalist's capital, but his active labor power. It is the worker himself who converts the money he receives for his labor power into means of subsistence, so as to transform these back into labor power and keep alive, just as the capitalist, for example, converts a part of the surplus value of the commodities that he sells for money into means of subsistence for himself, although no one would be led to say that the buyer of his commodities therefore pays him in means of subsistence. Even if the worker is paid a part of his wages in means of subsistence, in kind, this nowadays forms a second transaction. He sells his labor power for a definite price, and it is then agreed that he should receive a part of this price in means of subsistence. This only alters the form of the payment. It does not alter the fact that what he actually sells is labor power. This second transaction is no longer between worker and capitalist as such, but between the worker as buyer of commodities and the capitalist as their seller, whereas in the first transaction it was the worker who was the seller of a commodity, his own labor power, and the capitalist its buyer. It is just as if the capitalist had had his commodity replaced by another commodity, for example, as if he replaced the machine that he sells to an ironworks by iron. Thus, it is not the worker's means of subsistence that acquire the characteristic of fluid capital in contrast to fixed capital, and it is also not his labor power, but rather the portion of the value of the productive capital that is spent on it that has this characteristic in the turnover in common with some components of the constant part of the capital, and in contrast with other parts. The value of the fluid capital, both in labor power and means of production, is advanced only for the time that it takes to produce the product, according to the scale of production which is given by the volume of the fixed capital. This value enters in its entirety into the product, and thus returns again completely from circulation with the sale of the product and can be advanced afresh. The labor power and means of production in which the fluid components of the capital exists are withdrawn from the circulation sphere in the quantity needed for the formation and the sale of the finished product, but they must constantly be replaced and renewed by new purchases, by the transformation from the money form back into the elements of production. They are withdrawn from the market at any one time in smaller quantities and are the elements of fixed capital, but they must be withdrawn again all the more frequently, and the advance of the capital spent on them is repeated at shorter intervals. This regular repetition is mediated by the regular conversion of the product, which circulates their entire value. It is not only their value that continuously describes the whole circuit of metamorphoses, but also their material form. They are constantly transformed back from commodities into the elements of production of those commodities. Together with its own value, labor power constantly adds to the product's surplus value, i.e., the embodiment of unpaid labor. This surplus value is then just as constantly circulated by the finished product and transformed into money as are its other value elements. Here, however, where what we are concerned with in the first instance is the turnover of the capital value and not that of the surplus value that is turned over together with it, we shall disregard the latter for the time being. Our argument so far leads to the following conclusions. 1. The formal characteristics of fixed and fluid capital arise only from the different turnovers of the capital value or productive capital that functions in the production process. This difference in turnover arises for its part from the different ways in which the various components of the productive capital transfer their value to the product, though not from their different share in the production of the product's value or from their characteristic behavior in the valorization process. The different ways in which value is given up to the product, and hence also the different ways in which this value is circulated by the product and replaced in its original natural form as a result of its metamorphoses, ultimately arise from the different material shapes in which productive capital exists, one part of it being consumed entirely in the course of forming the particular product, while another is used up only gradually. Thus, it is only productive capital that can be divided up into fixed and fluid capital. This antithesis does not exist for the two other modes of existence of industrial capital, neither for commodity capital nor for money capital, nor yet as an antithesis between these two and productive capital. It exists only for productive capital and only within it. No matter how much money capital and commodity capital function as capital, and how fluidly they circulate, they can become fluid capital in contrast to fixed only when they have been transformed into the fluid components of productive capital. But because these two forms of capital inhabit the circulation sphere, economists have been misled ever since Adam Smith, as we shall see, into classing them together with the fluid part of productive capital under the heading of circulating capital. They are certainly capital of circulation, in contrast to productive capital, but they are not circulating capital in contrast to fixed capital. 2. The turnover of the fixed components of capital, and thus also the turnover time needed by it, encompasses several turnovers of the fluid components of capital. In the same time that it takes for the fixed capital to turn over once, the fluid capital turns over several times. The one component of the value of productive capital receives the formal characteristic of fixed capital only insofar as the means of production in which it exists are not used up in the space of time that it takes to produce the product and eject it from the production process as a commodity. A part of its value must remain tied up in the old and persisting use form, while another part is circulated by the finished product. In its circulation, however, the product circulates at the same time the total value of the fluid components of capital. 3. That part of the value of productive capital that is laid out on fixed capital is advanced all at once in its entirety for the whole period of functioning of that part of the means of production of which the fixed capital consists. The capitalist thus casts this value into the circulation sphere all at once, but it is withdrawn from circulation again only gradually and bit by bit, by the realization of the value portions that the fixed capital adds bit by bit to the commodities. The actual means of production themselves, however, in which a part of the productive capital is fixed, are withdrawn from circulation all at once, to be incorporated into the production process for the whole of the period during which they function, though they do not need throughout this time to be replaced by new items of the same kind, i.e. to be reproduced. They continue to contribute for a longer or shorter time to the formation of the commodities thrown into circulation, without withdrawing from circulation the elements of their own renewal. During this time, therefore, they do not require for their part any new advance on the part of the capitalist. Finally, while the effective life of the means of production in which it exists continues, the capital value laid out as fixed capital does not pass through the circuit of its forms materially, but only in its value, and this only partially and gradually. That is to say, a part of its value is continually circulated and transformed into money as a part of the value of the commodity, without being transformed back from money into its original natural form. This transformation of money back into the natural form of the instrument of production takes place only at the end of the latter's period of functioning, when the instrument of production has been completely used up. 4. The elements of fluid capital are just as permanently fixed in the production process, if this is to be continuous, as are the elements of fixed capital. But while the elements of the former that are fixed in this way are steadily renewed in kind, the means of production by new items of the same kind, labor power by ever-repeated purchases, the elements of fixed capital are neither themselves renewed as long as they last, nor does their purchase have to be repeated. Raw and ancillary materials are constantly present in the production process, but there are always new items of the same kind, the old ones having been consumed in the formation of the finished product. Just as constantly there is labor power in the production process, but only in association with the constant repetition of its purchase and often with the change of persons. However, the very same buildings, machines, etc. carry on functioning in the same repeated production processes while the fluid capital turns over repeatedly. Section 2. Components, replacement, repairs, and accumulation of the fixed capital. The various elements of fixed capital in a particular investment have differing lifespans, and hence also different turnover times. In a railway, for example, the rails, sleepers, earthwork, station buildings, bridges, tunnels, locomotives, and carriages all function for different periods and have different reproduction times, and so the capital advanced in them has different turnover times. The buildings, platforms, water tanks, viaducts, tunnels, cutting, and embankments, in short, all those things which on the English railways are called works of art, do not need to be renewed for a whole series of years. The things that wear out most quickly are the permanent way and the rolling stock. When modern railways were first constructed, the general opinion, backed by the most eminent practical engineers, was that a railway would last for centuries, and that the wear and tear of the tracks would be so negligible that it could be ignored for all financial and practical purposes. 100 to 150 years was considered the lifetime of good rails. It soon transpired, however, that the life of a rail, which of course depends on the speed of the locomotives, the weight and number of trains, the thickness of the rails themselves, and a number of secondary circumstances, is no more than 20 years on average. At certain particular stations and centers of heavy traffic, the rails actually wear out each year. Around 1867, steel rails began to be introduced, which, although they cost around twice as much as iron rails, last for more than twice as long. The lifespan of wooden sleepers was between 12 and 15 years. It also became evident, as far as the rolling stock was concerned, that goods wagons wore out significantly quicker than passenger carriages. In 1867, the life of a locomotive was estimated at between 10 and 12 years. Wear and tear is occasioned in the first place by actual use. As a general rule, the rails wear out in proportion to the number of trains. The wear and tear also increases by more than the square of the speed, i.e., if the speed of the trains doubles, then the wear and tear increases more than fourfold. A further item of wear and tear is that caused by natural forces. Sleepers, for example, do not just deteriorate as a result of actual use, but also suffer from rot. Quote, "The cost of maintaining the road does not depend so much upon the wear and tear of the traffic passing over it as upon the quality of the wood, iron, bricks, and mortar exposed to the atmosphere. A month of severe winter would do more damage to the road of a railway than a year's traffic." End quote from R.P. Williams on the maintenance and renewal of the permanent way, paper read at the Institute of Civil Engineers in autumn of 1866. Finally, as is the case throughout large-scale industry, moral deterioration also plays its part. After 10 years have elapsed, it is generally possible to buy the same quantity of carriages and locomotives for £30,000 as previously cost £40,000. A depreciation of 25% on the market price must thus be reckoned with this on material, even if there is no depreciation in the use value. Quote, Two bridges will not be replaced in their present form, because there are now better forms for such bridges. Ordinary repairs, taking away gradually and replacing, are not practicable. End quote from W.B. Adams, Roads and Rails, published in London, 1862. The means of labor are for the most part constantly revolutionized by the progress of industry. Hence they are not replaced in their original form but in the revolutionized form. On the other hand, the volume of fixed capital that is invested in a particular natural form and has to last out for a definite average lifespan within this is a reason why new machines, etc., are introduced only gradually, and hence forms an obstacle to the rapid general introduction of improved means of labor. On the other hand, competition forces the replacement of old means of labor by new ones before their natural demise, particularly when decisive revolutions have taken place. Catastrophes, crises, etc. are the principal causes that compel such premature renewals of equipment on a broad social scale. Depreciation, apart from moral depreciation, is the portion of value that the fixed capital gradually gives up to the product as it is used, according to the average degree of its loss of use value. This depreciation in part takes the form that the fixed capital has a certain average lifespan. It is completely advanced for this period of time, and after it has elapsed, must be completely replaced. In the case of living means of labor, such as horses for example, the reproduction time is prescribed by nature itself. Their average life as means of labor is determined by natural laws. Once this period has elapsed, the worn-out items must be replaced by new ones. A horse cannot be replaced bit by bit, but only by another horse. Other elements of the fixed capital permit periodic or partial renewal. This partial or periodic replacement should be distinguished from the gradual extension of a business. Fixed capital consists in part of components which are similar but do not last equally long, and are rather renewed bit by bit at different intervals and times. The rails at a station, for example, have to be replaced more often than the rails at other parts of the line. The same is the case with sleepers. Lardner states that in the 1850s on the Belgian railways, these had to be replaced at the rate of 8% per year, the whole of sleepers thus being replaced in the course of 12.5 years. Here the situation is as follows. A sum is advanced, for example, for 10 years on a particular kind of fixed capital. This outlay is made all at once, but a certain part of this fixed capital, the value of which has gone into the value of the product and has been converted along with this into money, is replaced each year in kind, while the remainder continues to exist in its original natural form. What distinguishes this fixed capital from fluid capital is precisely this outlay all at once and reproduction only bit by bit in the natural form. Other items of fixed capital consist of different types of components, which wear out and thus have to be replaced at different intervals of time. This is particularly the case with machines. The same applies here in connection with the life of those different components of one and the same machine forming an item of fixed capital, as we previously noted with respect to the varying life of different components of a total fixed capital. The following should be noted in connection with the gradual extension of a business in the course of partial renewal. Even though, as we have seen, the fixed capital continues to function in its natural form in the production process, if a part of its value has circulated with the product, according to the average wear and tear, and been transformed into money, then this forms an element of the money reserve fund for the replacement of the capital when its reproduction in kind falls due. This part of the fixed capital value transformed into money can therefore serve to expand the business or to effect improvements in the machines which increase their effectiveness. Reproduction then occurs, in shorter or longer periods, and from the social point of view this is reproduction on an expanded scale, extensively if the field of production is extended, intensively if the means of production are made more effective. This reproduction on an expanded scale does not arise from accumulation, the transformation of surplus value into capital, but from a retransformation of the value, which branches into two parts, and in its money form has separated itself off from the body of the fixed capital into new fixed capital of the same kind, either additional or more effective. Of course it depends in part on the specific nature of the business, how far and in what dimensions it is susceptible to a gradual addition of this kind, and thus also in what dimensions a reserve fund has to be built up in order to be reinvested in this way, and in what periods of time this can take place. How far improvements of detail to existing machinery can be brought about, on the other hand, naturally depends on the nature of the improvements and on the construction of the machine itself. Adams shows that this point is borne in mind very strongly, and from the start, in railway investments. Quote, "The whole structure should be set out on the principle which governs the beehive, capacity for indefinite extension. Any fixed and decided symmetrical structure is to be deprecated, as needing subsequent pulling down in case of enlargement." End quote. This, in turn, depends to a large extent on the space available. In some buildings, extra floors can be added, while others require horizontal extension and thus more land. While capitalist production is marked by the waste of much material, there is also much inappropriate horizontal extension of this kind, partly involving a loss of labor power, in the course of the gradual extension of a business, since nothing is done according to a social plan, but rather depends on the infinitely varied circumstances, means, etc., with which the individual capitalist acts. This gives rise to a major wastage of productive forces. The progressive reinvestment of the money reserve fund, i.e., of the part of the fixed capital that is transformed back into money, is most easily effected in agriculture. Here, a spatially given field of production is capable of the greatest gradual absorption of capital. The same is true when natural reproduction takes place, as in the case of cattle breeding. Fixed capital gives rise to special costs of maintenance. A part of the maintenance is effected by the labor process itself. Fixed capital spoils if it does not function in the labor process. See Volume 1, Chapter 8, page 315, and Chapter 15, page 528. Deterioration of machinery that arises from its non-use. The English law, therefore, expressly considers it as a waste if land that is farmed out is not cultivated according to custom. This maintenance that results from use in the labor process is a gift of nature provided gratis by living labor. In fact, the preserving power of labor is of a dual type. On the one hand, it preserves the value of the materials of labor by transferring it to the product, while on the other hand it preserves the value of the means of labor without transferring this value to the product by preserving their use value through their action in the production process. But fixed capital also requires positive outlays of labor if it is to be kept in good condition. The machinery must be cleaned from time to time. This involves additional labor, without which it becomes unfit for use. This is merely a defense against the damaging influence of the elements that is inseparable from the production process, and is thus keeping it in working order in the most literal sense. The normal lifespan of fixed capital is naturally reckoned on the assumption that the conditions under which it can function normally during this time are fulfilled, just as it is assumed, if the average life of a man is taken as 30 years, that he washes himself. What is involved here is not the replacement of the labor contained in the machine, but additional labor that is constantly necessary for it to be used. This is not a matter of labor performed by the machine, but of labor performed on the machine. Hence, it is not an agent of production, but rather raw material. The capital spent on this labor is part of the fluid capital, even though it does not properly enter the actual labor process to which the product owes its origin. The labor must be constantly performed in the course of production, and so its value must also be constantly replaced by the value of the product. The capital spent on it belongs to that part of fluid capital that has to cover the general overheads, and is distributed over the value of the product according to an average annual calculation. As we have seen, in industry proper, this work of cleaning is performed by the workers for nothing during breaks, and for this reason it is often actually done during the production process itself, where it is a major source of accidents. This labor does not count in the price of the product. In this respect, the consumer receives it gratis. The capitalist, moreover, does not have to pay anything for the maintenance of his machine. The worker pays in his own person, and this forms one of the mysteries of capital's self-preservation, constituting in point of fact a legal chain of the worker on the machinery, and making him a co-owner of this even from the standpoint of bourgeois right. But in various branches of production, where the machinery has to be removed from the production process for cleaning, and the cleaning cannot therefore take place on the quiet, as with locomotives, for example, this maintenance work counts as running costs, i.e., as an element of fluid capital. Quote, "A goods engine should not run more than 3 days without being kept 1 day in the shed. If you attempt to wash out the boiler before it is cooled down, that is very injurious." End quote. Repairs proper, the work of patching up, require an outlay of capital and labor which is not contained in the capital originally advanced, and thus cannot always be replaced and covered by the gradual replacement of the fixed capital. If the value of the fixed capital is £10,000, and its overall life is 10 years, then this £10,000, when after 10 years it is completely transformed into money, replaces only the value of the original capital investment. It does not replace the capital or labor newly added in between times for repairs. This is an additional component of value, which is not advanced all at once, but rather according to need, and its various times of advance are by the nature of the case accidental. All fixed capital requires these later doses of additional capital outlay on means of labor and labor power. The damage to which particular parts of the machinery, etc., are exposed are by nature accidental, and hence so are also the repairs necessitated by such damage. However, two kinds of repair works can be singled out here. both having a more or less firm character and falling in different periods of the fixed capital's lifetime: childhood infirmities and the far more numerous ailments of the years beyond middle age. No matter how perfectly constructed a machine may be when it enters the production process, faults become evident with actual use, and they have to be corrected by subsequent work. Moreover, the more it passes beyond its middle years, and thus the more that normal wear and tear mounts up, and the material it is made of becomes worn out and weak with age, the more frequent and serious becomes the repair work needed to keep the machine going until the end of its average life, just as an old man has more medical expenses than a man in the prime of life, if he is not to die before his time. Despite its accidental character, therefore, the work of repair is distributed unevenly over the various periods of the fixed capital's life. It follows from this, as well as from the otherwise accidental character of the repair work on a machine, firstly, that the actual expenditure on labor power and means of labor for repair work is accidental, as are the circumstances themselves that make these repairs necessary. The extent of the repairs needed is differentially distributed over the various periods of the fixed capital's life. It is, however, assumed in assessing the average life of the fixed capital that it is constantly maintained in working condition, partly by cleaning, which includes keeping clean its site, partly by repairs, as often as these are required. The transfer of value through the wear and tear of the fixed capital is calculated over its average period of life, but this average period is itself calculated on the assumption that the additional capital required to keep it in working order is continuously advanced. Secondly, it is equally clear that the value added by this additional expenditure of capital and labor cannot go into the price of commodities in step with the actual expenditure itself. A cotton spinner, for instance, cannot sell his yarn dearer this week than last week because he had a wheel broken or a belt snapped. The general costs of spinning are in no way affected by this accident in an individual factory. Experience shows the average extent of such accidents and the work of maintenance and repair needed during the average life of a fixed capital invested in a certain line of business. This average expenditure is distributed over its average life and added in corresponding adequate parts to the price of the product, and this is how it is replaced by the product sale. The extra capital that is replaced in this way is part of the fluid capital, even though the expenditure is of an irregular kind. Since it is of the utmost importance to treat every ailment of the machinery immediately, every large factory has, in addition to the factory workers proper, a staff of engineer, carpenter, mechanic, fitter, etc. Their wages form a part of the variable capital, and the value of their labor is distributed over the product. The expenditure that the means of production require is determined according to this average calculation and always forms a corresponding portion of the value of the product, even though it is in fact advanced at irregular intervals and so also enters the product, i.e. the fixed capital, irregularly. This capital spent on repairs, in the strict sense, forms in many respects a capital of a peculiar kind. It cannot be properly classed either as fluid or as fixed capital, but, since it is a part of the running expenses, it tends more towards the first of the two forms. The way the books are kept does not, of course, affect the actual relationships of the things entered in the accounts, but it is important to note that in many lines of business, it is customary to calculate the repair costs in conjunction with the actual wear and tear of the fixed capital, in the following way. If the fixed capital advanced is £10,000, its life 15 years, then the annual depreciation is £666 2/3 pounds. If the depreciation is now calculated over 10 years only, then instead of £666 2/3 pounds, £1,000 is added annually to the price of the goods produced to compensate for the wearing out of the fixed capital, i.e. £333 1/3 pounds is reserved for repairs, etc. The figures 10 and 15 are taken only for the sake of example. This, then, is the amount spent on repairs on an average so that the fixed capital may last for 15 years. This calculation does not, of course, prevent the fixed capital and the additional capital spent on repairs from forming different categories. On the basis of this way of calculating, it has been assumed, for example, that the lowest cost estimate for the maintenance and replacement of steamships would be 15% per year, i.e. a reproduction time of 6 2/3 years. In the 1860s, the British government compensated the Peninsular and Oriental Company at an annual rate of 16%, which assumes a reproduction time of 6 1/4 years. In the case of railways, the average life of a locomotive is 10 years, but if repairs are included, the depreciation is taken as 12.5%, which reduces the lifespan to 8 years. For passenger coaches and goods wagons, 9% is reckoned, i.e. a life of 11 1/9 years. In connection with contracts of rental for houses and other things that are fixed capital for their proprietors and are rented out as such, legislation has always recognized the distinction between normal deterioration produced by time, the influence of the elements, and normal wear and tear, and the occasional repairs that are necessary from time to time for the maintenance in the course of the normal life of a house and its normal use. As a rule, the first fall on the landlord, the second on the tenant. Repairs are further divided into ordinary and substantial. The latter represent in part a renewal of fixed capital in its natural form, and also fall on the landlord, unless the contract expressly states the opposite. Thus, in English law, for example, quote, "A tenant, from year to year, on the other hand, is not bound to do more than keep the premises wind and water tight, when that can be done without substantial repairs, and generally to do repairs coming fairly under the head of ordinary. Even with respect to those parts of the premises which are subject of ordinary repairs, regard must be had to their age and general state, and condition when he took possession, for he is not bound to replace old and worn-out materials with new ones, nor to make good the inevitable depreciation resulting from time and ordinary wear and tear." End quote from Holdsworth, Law of Landlord and Tenant, pages 90 and 91. Something that is quite different both from the replacement of wear and tear and from the work of repair and maintenance is insurance, which relates to the destruction by way of extraordinary natural events, fire, flood, etc. This must be made good out of surplus value and forms a deduction from it. Considered from the standpoint of the whole society, there must be a constant overproduction, i.e., production on a greater scale than is needed for the simple replacement and reproduction of the existing wealth, quite apart from any increase in population, for the society to have at its disposal the means of production needed to make good unusual destruction caused by accidents and natural forces. In actual fact, only a very small part of the capital needed for replacement exists in the money reserve fund. The most significant part exists in the extension of the scale of production itself, which is partly an actual expansion and partly falls within the normal capacity of the branches of production that produced fixed capital. An engineering works, for example, is organized to take account of both an annual expansion of the factories of all its customers and the need of part of them for reproduction, as a whole or in part. When wear and tear and repair costs are determined on a social average, great unevenness necessarily arises, even for equally large capital investments in the same branch of production which are under otherwise similar conditions. In practice, a machine, etc., will last one capitalist longer than the average period, and another capitalist not so long. The repair costs of the one are above the average, those of the other below it, etc. But the addition to the price determined by wear and tear and by repair costs is the same in both cases and is determined on the average. Thus the increase in price brings the one more than he actually added and the other less. This circumstance, like all others that lead the profit of different capitalists in the same line of business to differ, given the same exploitation of labor power, helps to make insight into the true nature of surplus value more difficult. The boundary between what is repair and what is replacement, between costs of maintenance and costs of renewal, is a more or less shifting one. This gives rise to a perpetual struggle, in the railways, for example, as to whether certain expenses are repairs or replacement, whether they are to be met from current expenditure or from the original capital. The transfer of repair costs to the capital account instead of the current account is a well-known device through which railway directors artificially rack up their dividends. Here, too, experience has already provided the most fundamental reference points. The subsequent works undertaken during the early life of a railway, for example, quote, ought not to be denominated repairs, but should be considered as an essential part of the construction of the railway, and in the financial accounts should be debited to capital and not to revenue, not being expenses due to wear and tear or to the legitimate operation of the traffic, but to the original and inevitable incompleteness of the construction of the line. End quote from Lardner. Quote, the only sound way is to charge each year's revenue with the depreciation necessarily suffered to earn the revenue whether the amount is actually spent or not. End quote from Captain Fitzmaurice, Committee of Inquiry on the Caledonian Railway, published in Money Market Review on the 25th of January 1868. In agriculture, it becomes in practice impossible and meaningless to separate the replacement of the fixed capital from its maintenance, at least insofar as steam power is not yet used. Quote, when there is a full, though not excessive, stock of implements, of agricultural and other elements and appliances of all kinds, the general rule is to estimate the annual wear and tear together with the maintenance of the implements, according to the different conditions obtaining, at 15 to 25% of the original capital. End quote from Kirchhoff. In the case of railway rolling stock, it is quite impossible to separate repairs from replacement. Quote, we maintain our stock by number. Whatever numbers of engines we have, we maintain that. If one is destroyed by age, and it is better to build a new one, we build it at the expense of revenue, of course, taking credit for the materials of the old ones as far as they go. There is a great deal left. There are the wheels, the axles, the boilers, and in fact a great deal of the old engine is left. End quote from T. Gooch, chairman of the Great Western Railway Company, R.C. on the Railways, page 858. Quote, repairing means renewing. I do not believe in the word replacement. Once a railway company has bought a vehicle or an engine, it ought to be repaired, and in that way admit of going on forever. The engines are maintained forever out of this 8.5 pence. We rebuild our engines. If you purchase an engine entirely, it would be spending more money than is necessary. Yet there is always a pair of wheels or an axle or some portion of the engine which comes in, and hence it cheapens the cost of producing a practically new engine. I am at this moment turning out a new engine every week, or practically a new engine, for it has a new boiler, cylinder, or framing. End quote from Archibald Sturrock, locomotive superintendent of the Great Northern Railway, in R.C., 1867. The same with carriages. Quote, in the course of time, the stock of engines and vehicles is continually repaired. New wheels are put on at one time and a new body at another. The different moving parts most subject to wear are gradually renewed, and the engines and vehicles may be conceived even to be subject to such succession of repairs that in many of them not a vestige of the original material remains. Even in this case, however, the old materials of coaches or engines are more or less worked up into other vehicles or engines and never totally disappear from the road. The movable capital, therefore, may be considered to be in a state of continual reproduction, and that which, in the case of the permanent way, must take place altogether at a future epoch, when the entire road will have to be relaid, takes place in the rolling stock gradually from year to year. Its existence is perennial, and it is in a constant state of rejuvenescence. End quote from Lardner. The process depicted here by Lardner, in the case of the railways, does not apply to an individual factory, but it does provide a picture of the constant partial reproduction of the fixed capital, shot through with repairs, that takes place within an entire branch of industry, or generally within production as a whole considered on the social scale. Here is some evidence of the broad limits within which clever directors can manipulate the concept of repairs and replacement in the interests of their dividends. According to the above-quoted paper by R.P. Williams, various English railway companies annually wrote off the following average sums over a number of years for repairs and maintenance of the permanent way and buildings for each mile of track. London and North Western, £370. Midland, £225. London and South Western, £257. Great Northern, £310. Lancashire and Yorkshire, £377. South Eastern, £263. Brighton, £266. Manchester and Sheffield, £200. These differences arise only to a very slight degree from variations in actual expenditure. They are almost exclusively due to differing modes of calculation, according to whether items are debited to the capital account or the current account. Williams says, in so many words, that a lesser charge is put down when this is necessary for a good dividend, and a higher figure when there is a greater revenue able to bear it. In certain cases, the wear and tear, and thus replacement for it, is in practice of an infinitesimal magnitude, so that it is only repair costs that come into the balance. What Lardner says about works of art, in the case of the railways, holds good generally for all similarly durable works such as canals, docks, iron and stone bridges, etc. He refers to, quote, that wear and tear which, being due to the slow operation of time acting upon the more solid structures, produces an effect altogether insensible when observed through short periods, but which, after a long interval of time, such for example as centuries, must necessitate the reconstruction of some or all even of the most solid structures. These changes may not be unaptly assimilated to the periodical and secular inequalities which take place in the movements of the great bodies of the universe. The operation of time upon the more massive works of art upon the railway, such as the bridges, tunnels, viaducts, etc., afford examples of what may be called the secular wear and tear. The more rapid and visible deterioration, which is made good by repairs or reconstruction effected at shorter intervals, is analogous to the periodic inequalities. In the annual repairs is included the casual damage which the exterior of the more solid and durable works may from time to time sustain. But independently of these repairs, age produces its effects even on these structures, and an epoch must arrive, however remote it be, at which they would be reduced to a state which will necessitate their reconstruction. For financial and economic purposes, such an epoch is perhaps too remote to render it necessary to bring it into practical calculation, and therefore it need here only be noticed in passing. End quote from Lardner. This applies to all similar works with a long span of life, so that the capital advanced in them does not have to be gradually replaced in accordance with its wear and tear, but it is only the annual average costs of maintenance and repair that are transferred to the price of the product. Even though, as we have seen, a large part of the money that flows back to replace the wear and tear of the fixed capital is transformed back into its natural form annually, or even more frequently, each individual capitalist still needs an amortization fund on the part of the fixed capital that reaches its term of reproduction only after a period of years, and then has to be replaced entirely. A significant component of the fixed capital excludes piecemeal reproduction by its very nature. Apart from the case where reproduction takes place bit by bit in such a way that new stock is added to the depreciated old stock at short intervals, a prior accumulation of money is necessary, of a greater or lesser amount according to the specific character of the branch of production in question, before this replacement can occur. This cannot be just any sum of money whatever, an amount of a certain size is required. If we consider this exclusively on the assumption of simple money circulation, without any regard to the credit system, this will be brought in later, then the mechanism of the movement is as follows. In the first volume, see Chapter 3, Section 3, Subsection A, it was shown that although a part of the money present in a society always lies fallow in the form of a hoard, while another part functions as means of circulation, or as an immediate reserve fund of directly circulating money, the proportion in which the total quantity of money is divided between hoards and means of circulation constantly alters. In our present case, money that has to be accumulated on a large scale as a hoard in the hands of a big capitalist is thrown into circulation all at once on the purchase of fixed capital. It is then divided up again in the society between means of circulation and hoard. By way of the amortization fund, in which the value of the fixed capital flows back to its starting point in proportion to the wear and tear, a part of the money in circulation again forms a hoard, for a longer or shorter period of time, in the hands of the same capitalist whose hoard was transformed into means of circulation and separated from him with his acquisition of fixed capital. There is a constantly changing distribution of the hoard existing in a society, which alternately functions as means of circulation and is then again divided off from the mass of circulating money as a hoard. With the development of the credit system, which necessarily runs parallel with the development of large-scale industry and capitalist production, this money no longer functions as a hoard but as capital, though not in the hands of its proprietor, but rather of other capitalists at whose disposal it is put.